This week's blog post is The History of Outdoor Sculpture in New York City, Part 1. The occasional series of blog posts that starts this week will highlight the most important of the outdoor sculptures in New York City and provide some historical and art historical context. For the complete sequence of sculptures, see the series of photos that I've been posting on Instagram since August 2019. There's a link in the blog post. They're all in chronological order. It's good to have a database, with a short blurb on the subject and/or the artist of each. As we start, I want to have a quick look at the state of sculpture in the United States when the United States was relatively young. Many of our iconic images of America's founding fathers, Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson, as well as this one of Lafayette, were created by Jean-Antoine Houdon, 1741 to 1828. Houdon could create images of young and old, statesmen and soldiers and children that were so distinctively individual that you would recognize them if you met them on the street, and also so lively that you wonder what they're thinking. You can see Houdon's skill in the subtle planes of Lafayette's face here, and in the exquisite variation in textures of his face, hair, coat, cravat, and epaulettes. This 1932 copy of Houdon's 1789 bust was placed in the Bronx Hall of Fame of Great Americans nearly 200 years after his death. In 18th and 19th century Europe, where monarchs, noblemen, and the wealthy could afford their services, sculptors such as Houdon thrived. But in the early decades of the United States, there was little demand for sculptors. Not surprisingly, no schools or ateliers existed to offer training to aspiring sculptors. So American sculptors eventually traveled to Europe to study with top-notch sculptors there. But meanwhile, many of the earliest works erected outdoors in New York City were by European artists. For example, this is Christophe Fratin, Eagles and Prey. It was cast in 1850 and placed in Central Park in 1863. What's the background of this? The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the rise of Romanticism. Here's what I said about that in Seismic Shifts in Subject and Style, 19th Century French Painting and Philosophy, Chapter 4. Quote, "In the visual arts, Romanticism was largely confined to painting, beginning with Giovanni Battista Piranesi, 1720 to 1778, Henry Fuseli, 1741 to 1825, and Francisco de Goya, 1746 to 1828, artists rebelled against the noble simplicity and quiet grandeur that Winckelmann had advocated, and which, in the form of neoclassicism, had swept through Europe during the late 18th century. Romantic painters focused instead on subjects calculated to arouse strong passions. The passions could be as positive as love or as negative as terror. The important thing was to make the viewer feel something." That's the end of the passage from Seismic Shifts. Sculptures of wild animals were an offshoot of Romanticism in France. Showing nature red in tooth and claw was another way of eliciting strong feelings. Animaliers such as Fratin and Antoine-Louis Barrier, 1795 to 1875, were early artists working in a genre that continued well into the 20th century. In 1863, 13 years after Fratin had sculpted it, a cast of Eagles and Prey was erected northwest of the Mall in Central Park. Olmsted, who was infuriated when roaming goats ate the park's newly planted greenery, probably smiled grimly at the sight of this large bronze sculpture showing the gory death of a goat. Eagles and Prey was the second sculpture placed in the park, following Schiller, which was created and dedicated in 1859, and that will be in next week's post. This grave monument from 1853 is in the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and it honors DeWitt Clinton, who was governor of New York, 1817 to 22 and 1825 to 28, was largely responsible for the Erie Canal. The canal, one of the engineering feats of the early 19th century, transformed New York City into the East Coast's trading hub. The reliefs on the sculpture's base represent the construction of the Erie Canal and commerce on the canal. This is the first in a long line of New York City sculptures honoring politicians in New York and the United States. You might ask, why is Clinton, who lived from 1769 to 1828, wearing a toga atop his 19th century business suit? The answer is that this work is in the neoclassical style. Neoclassicism, one of the most popular schools of sculpture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was thought to bring the grandeur of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire into the modern era. Henry Kirk Brown, who created this sculpture, spent the early 1840s studying sculpture in Italy. He was one of the earliest American sculptors to do so. Although I don't think he has the skill and the scope of Houdon, he is quite competent, and we will see an even more ambitious work by him next week. And the last piece we'll look at this week. This is the Atlas clock on Tiffany's Fifth Avenue facade. Another thread in American sculpture is the tradition of wood carving associated with ships' figureheads. Usually these pieces come under the category of folk art. But in 1853, Charles Tiffany commissioned his friend Henry Frederick Metzler, a maker of figureheads, to create a figure of Atlas for the Tiffany store at 550 Broadway. It was at that point between Prince and Spring Streets. The 9-foot-tall wooden figure, painted to look like bronze, traveled with Tiffany's headquarters as it moved to Union Square, and then to 37th Street, and then to 57th Street, where it is now. I've given you a link to images of Atlas in the earlier locations. Copies of this sculpture now adorn major Tiffany locations across America. Next week we will see New York City's first equestrian sculpture and more. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the free Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.